So today we're pleased to have Lucia Farinati, who studied art history in Italy, where she's from, and then studied at Goldsmiths in curating, and now is doing her PhD, which
Kingston.
I'm sure she's going to tell us about, at Kingston University here in London. So welcome, Lucia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John, for inviting me here. So it's 2 hours, quite a long time. So I decided to structure the lecture in 3 parts. So I will give a little bit of information about my background and different projects. So a mini CV squeeze in 10 minutes. And then I will focus my presentation on the paper which explore dialogic practices in 3 particular projects I was involved in. And I will play some sound along. And then I would like to leave at least half an hour for question and other requests. So I have few sound file with me, and you are welcome to ask me what you would like to listen on addition of what I play today. So I'm going on this page now. Right. So I've been, as John said, I studied curating, and I've been involved in several projects. As a curator, I commission sound artists and musicians site-specific work, and that started in 2013 with a collective Explo from New York. I have to say that my encounter with sound is totally incidental. The reason why I moved to UK is because I was very interested in public art, and I was doing research on public art. So for me, it was a project exploring, in this case, the East End of London, a question issue of gentrification, and this was a bus tour through the East End, and it was very much based on field recordings and sound play on the bus. So more or less 5 years later, this project, I went back to the East End. As you know, London hosted the Olympics in 2012, and this was more a project bordering with activism. It was a collaborative project with other researcher and curator and artist, and it was the idea was to map this area prior the closure of the park, the construction of the Olympic Park, and we named the project after those signs that we encounter along our walks. It was constructed around 10 walks with residents of the area which were evicted, activists and ecologists, and it took place very much in this area, and all this field research was brought together in a symposium, and where we discussed different issues. It was a very, very intense project, quite difficult to manage, and emotionally as well, quite difficult. So after this project, I decided to kind of think about how socially engaged practice or artistic practice can actually inhabit that space. But I went back to Italy, and in my own region, which is Trentino Alto Adige, and so it's bordering, is in the Italian Alps. In 2007, I established with Daniela Cascella, writer, Sound Threshold, which is a curatorial platform that explores the relationship between sound, sight, and text. And we invited Chris Watson, who is probably you know already who is he, but Chris Watson, a sound recordist, specialized in recording sound of the environment and above all animals. And so the idea was to work with him. He was in residence at the Center for Alpine Ecology, and he produced like a soundscape of Trentino, and we work very much in this kind of context. We inaugurated the project with a concert in this incredible scenario with Fuvea X. So the idea was also to bring listening in different contexts. And but we also worked with the duo Carl Markol van Haus or Leif Elgrin, and that site was an archaeological site. This duo from Sweden started a project called The Kingdom of Vargaland, a fictional kingdom, and in this case we used the archaeological site as a site where to present this project, and again it was very much based on sound installation in the site. The second season of Sound Threshold, we call it season, so that was an interesting way to put it, was back in London, and here we decided to explore listening in the context of museum galleries and looking at different formats of listening in those contexts, not simply as a live performances, but also as workshop and experiment way of listening in which can bring different discipline and point of view. And here we inhabit this space of showroom was already set up there. So, and artist Pedro Lash came out with the idea of the veil conversation. So we were doing some listening session under the veil and trying to figure out how it works. Another project that was part of the listening project, it was at the Flat Time House, former house of John Latham in South London. And so here the idea was to use the house of John Latham as a kind of broadcast unit. I collaborated with Resonance FM, and we did a series of conversation and performances in the place and broadcasts from the house. And here is a picture of the Bowman brothers, who are an improviser and who did a piece from a letter of John Latham. So there was also this idea of activating the archive of John Latham and using material from the place. And we work also with the Freud Museum, because my interest was also connected to the idea of voice, the hearing voices, and this is a project by Richard Crowe, who engage and revisit this text by Jean-Paul Schreiber, which was one of the case studies of Freud. So the idea of bringing Schreiber back to the house, Freud was quite provocative. I don't tell you all the story, but it's a fascinating story. And also with Leif Elgrin, we went back to the Freud Museum, and Leif, who is a sound artist, but also a writer and a visual artist himself. It came with the idea of recording the couch, under the couch of Freud. This is the couch where Freud was analyzing all his patients, so it's a very iconic object and almost untouchable. When we tried to have a conversation with the Freud Museum, said, "Why you want to do this? This is, it's a very important piece of the collection. We cannot lift it. We cannot put stuff underneath." So there was all this debate, and finally we managed to do it. And Leif released a CD that I brought with me. So if you want to listen to some recordings, I can play later. The last two projects back in Italy, again, this was an invitation from Radio Papese to work on the landscape of Tuscany, again, very iconic landscape. And these were commission for radio, so they were, again, project that was happening on the site, but then conceived and constructed for radio. And my last, I would say last, because I'm not doing so many commission now, and although Sound Threshold is still active as a platform for the collaboration with different artists, I moved more recently to research. So this project was done in collaboration with Elico Trema. It's an Italian festival. I think probably you're familiar because there was a collaboration, I think, with the LCC and Elico Trema. And this project was during the festival of Fies. It's a festival of dance and theater. And in a kind of industrial building. And this time I really wanted to go back to a part of history which is still very important and painful, which is the witch hunt that in Trentino was quite big things. And 1717 is the date of the last trial that sentenced to death Zambanella, this young woman that was accused of witchcraft. And I call this project Sonic Sabbath. Sabbath is the name the Inquisitor gave to this night gathering of the witches, which was happening obviously on full moon, midnight, and it was very much a party around music and different things. So I come out with the idea of the Sonic Sabbath as an invitation to all my women friends who are involved in activism. They are poets, they are artists, they are women. And so I put together this playlist of different tracks trying to narrate different moments of what witchcraft would mean today in our context. And I can talk about this again if you are more curious about this project. I have the audio with me. Just drink some water. So this was my curator CV in 10 minutes. And so yes, my project, as you saw, was they are very much site-specific project, which involved a lot of field research. And but since the cuts to arts and culture after the Olympics, I found very, very difficult to work as an independent curator, and I got really frustrated in doing funding application. And I realized that the project I was doing, they were very much crossover with research. So in fact, they asked and said, why are you doing research? Why you don't have HRC funding? So because I'm not an academic, because I'm not based in academia. So there was all this discussion where to place Sound Threshold. Is it research, is live performance, is music, and what it is. And the difficulties is very common. Although we are in an age where we talk about interdisciplinarity, this notion is very, very difficult to be accepted in the context of cultural institution and above all funding body. So I decided to kind of move towards research and start a PhD and rethinking my curatorial practice in relation to research. But yes, so here I would like to now talk about three specific projects which illustrate or give you an idea, I hope, of the role of sound and listening in dialogic practices. And for me, dialogue it represents a critical methodology, above all in my work as a curator. And I've always been interested in talking to artists and establish with them a long-term collaboration. I'm also been very interested in the artist interview as a critical practice, as a specific form of art criticism. I always have a kind of resistance of writing a critical essay. I do eventually, but I always been, I think I'm much more interested and fascinated by what an artist have to say about his or her own work. And so I feel that my role is more to be more like a facilitator and establish this dialogue. And yeah, so the other point I'm interested, the other way to look at dialogue and conversation is also as an art form in itself. And I will talk in a minute about AudioArts project, which is a very exemplifying this idea of the conversation as an art form itself. And the third point of dialogue for me is connected to activism, and in particular to feminist political practice. So in 2011, I joined the collective Precarious Workers Brigade, and so and I start looking at issue of politics from the point of view of direct action. So, but of course, dialogue or dialogic practices are dialogue is a basic form of human communication, and a way, is a way in which we relate to each other. When I talk about in terms of practice specifically, I talk about dialogue as a mean of doing and making, and the way dialogue has been shaped, organized, choreographed, or constitute a very fascinating history. And beside art and politics, there are many dialogic practices, such as oral history, psychoanalysis, and certain type of education, which are not frontal like I'm doing now. It's more like about this reciprocity of speaking and listening. And that is where my projects are seated at the moment. So the three project is a book called written by Carla Lonzi, Italian art critic and feminist, and she wrote this book in 1969, and it's a book that collects artist interviews edited in a free montage. The other project is AudioArts. It's a sound magazine that was established by William Furlong and Barry Barker in 1973, and which constitute the subject of my current PhD. And the third project is the book I co-authored with Claudia Firth, The First Listening, and which explore listening at the intersection of art and activism. So I will now go into these three projects. So Audrey Tautou means self-portrait, and I start with this not just because it's a woman book, but chronologically speaking, we are going back to the 60s. So a period where the experimentation with the logic practices was particularly vital both in art and politics. And this book collects recorded interview between 1965 and 1969, and they were transcribed and freely edited in an imaginary gathering in which 14 protagonists of contemporary art converse. And these artists are Accardi, Giannis Cunellis, Giulio Paolino, Lucio Fontana, Pino Pascali, etc., etc. You can see them in the cover. Some of these artists are known internationally as the protagonists of arte povera, a term that was introduced by Germano Celland, curator Germano Celland in 1967. But at the time, Carla Lonzi knew these artists already. She was very close to them, and she was already an established art critic and historian. But however, this is the last book that she wrote as an art critic, because in 1970s, she resigned from the role of art critique and established the first feminist consciousness raising group in Italy called Female Revolta, and together with Carla Cardi and Elvira Banotti. And so I like to define Autoritratto as a kind of threshold book, because it represents a moment of passage of Lonzi from art criticism to political activism. And in the preface of Autoritratto, she wrote, this book was born from the collection and editing of conversation made with some artists. But the conversations were not born as material for a book. They respond less to the need to understand than to the need to entertain each other in a communicative and humanly satisfying way. At some point, the artwork was felt by me as a possibility of an encounter, as an invitation addressed by the artist directly to each of us. When I read this line, at some point, the artwork was felt by me as a possibility of an encounter. I was very, very moved and thrilled by it, because the whole idea of art as a relation, as an encounter, as a process rather than an end product, really fascinated me since late 90s, when I discovered this book, Mapping the Terrain, New Genre Public Art by artist and feminist Susan Lacy. In this book, Lacy, she collected a series of practices that really put listening at the center, and the new genre public art was the idea to contrast the idea of public art as simply sculpture seated in public space. Here, the public, it means working in a participatory way with the audience, involving the participant in the work. And so I was happily shocked, if I can say that, so that in Italy there was that kind of crossover between participatory practice and activism already in the 60s. It's just a history that we don't know. So in 2013, when Elena Bizerna, when Elena Bizerna and Rita Corredo, two young curators from Italy, invited me to take part of another radio project. This time it was a Radio Fujiko in Bologna. I proposed to do a collective reading of Autoritratto, and I decided to title the project Come una possibilità d'incontro, as a possibility of an encounter. And here, the idea was not simply to do a reading for broadcast, but also to use the book as a device to generate real gathering. And so we organized several reading groups across London and Italy. And the invitation was, for me, on one hand, to reflect on the discursive art practices, question issue of participation, dialogue, and commoning in that particular moment. And the task of each meeting was to read the text aloud, to give the words to give voice to the words and conversation that makes up Autoritratto. And it was really much an exercise of revocalizing this text. So I would like to play now a little extract from the introduction, where everybody are speaking out their name and their role in the book. It's in Italian, but I think it's quite easy to follow.
Io sono Emilio Fantin nel ruolo di Carla Lonzi.
Io sono Gaspare Caliri e nel ruolo di Pietro Consagra.
Io sono Eleonora Grassi e faccio Castellani.
Io sono Tristan Chirone e faccio Pino Pascale.
Giorgio Androtta Carò, Iannis Conellis.
Rita Correddu, leggo Mimmo Rotella. Io Chiara Servalli sono scarpista.
Elena Biserna, leggo Giulio Paolini.
Io sono Matteo Ferrari e leggo Turcato.
Io sono Laura Ulisse e leggo Nigro.
Io sono Maria Rapagnetta e leggo Lucio Fontana.
Io sono Elisa Fontana e sono Luciano Fabro.
Io sono Alessandra Di Matteo e sono Viviani.
I am Richard Crew in the role of Sai Twombly.
Sono Lucia Farinati nel ruolo di Carla Caldi.
Cosa vuoi che ti racconti? Se non mi dici di cosa devo parlare? Cosa devo dire? Più o meno.
Okay, that is for later. So, just a minute, going from one presentation to another. The idea was not to perform the book. The idea was to read the book. And I didn't ask professional actors to be involved in this project. So there was no preparation. We just sit down in the room. We decided who role we wanted to take, and just read it. And there was always the exact number of readers correspond to the exact number of people in the book. So there was no audience. We were all reader, commentator, and speaker somehow. And for me, it was very important because the project was not done for any particular public venue. It was the gathering was in domestic settings. After the book, there was time for discussion and eating and drinking. So the idea was very much to create this convivial space, and the way I put together these groups, it was based on three simple principles: affinity, friendship, and let me go to the slides. Proximity, affinity, and friendship. So who is close to me? Who had the same issue I have in this moment of my life? Who are my friends? And that it was the way in which we gathered together, and Rita as well, and Elena, who were the co-curator, invited the people according to this principle. So there was no CV involved, or no any idea of doing something about an institutional project. And this at the core of this project, I think there was my personal anxiety of repositioning my curatorial practice in that particular moment. It was 2 years after the Occupy London happened in London, and I was very much involved in the period with the collective, the Precarious Workers Brigade. So there was a lot of questioning about what is art, what is activism, what is the intersection between the two, and I felt that, and I still feel that the relationship with the artist really changed over the past 20 years, because this constant pressure of fundraising, marketing, writing press releases, all that crap really is nothing to do with the creative moment of making a work. I felt that there was too much pressure as a curator on that side, and I wanted really to create a moment of micropolitics with my peer and understand where to go next. So why did I choose Autoritratto? Why did I choose this particular book to kind of reposition myself? Autoritratto is a very good example of dialogic writing, and here I put a page so you have an idea how it's constructed, and the dialogue is not there to sustain any particular philosophical discourse, as you know, in Western metaphysics, like Plato used dialogue in the book. Audrey Tautou really stemmed from the desire, the urgency of Lonzi to unpack the power relationship, the power relation between the art critic and the artist. And in that particular moment, in the 60s, we had to think that a lot of art critic, they were male, powerful men. And so she felt that she had to withdraw from that. But also from the idea of the power of the art critic to speak about an artwork. And on the other hand, the privilege of the artist of being seen as the creator, the only possible creator. So as several scholars of Lonzi, I'm not a scholar of Lonzi, I might probably write in the future in an academic way, but I've been talking to different people that actually study Lonzi in depth, and they see a kind of crossover between Lonzi mode of writing and oral history and ethnomusicology and even surrealist writing, and they're all very interesting crossover. But it's interesting that the transcription of the audio interview, they pay particular attention to the quality of word and utterances. So, and the text it seems to ask to be read aloud, to be vocalized and performed to the body of the reader. And so I will give now, we will try to do this. I will keep the text there and play the reading. Let's see if I'm gonna be able to do that. It's in Italian, so there is no translation, so I don't have choice.
Mi devi interrogare, più o meno provocare.
Cominciamo da un punto qualunque, perché io desidero solo...
Preferire una specie di temino.
Io potrei smettere di fare il pittore, il produttore plastico e fare altre cose, non so, l'esploratore, il guerriero, il francescano, non lo so.
Mi sono scordato quello che ti ho detto l'anno scorso e non so cosa dirti quest'anno.
Di alcuni lavori mi pare che ho già parlato, ma sarà bene che per galanteria mi ripeta.
Ecco, facciamo proprio così, tranquilli.
Ecco, Roma 13.
Settembre, primo pomeriggio. Prova a sentire se la registrazione e il volume vanno bene. Allora, Carla, dimmi qualcosa. Eccitami.
Tu che sei bella.
Vorrei dire questo qui.
Tu dovresti fare una cosa così, però discorsiva, ossia non tu che domandi.
Sì, no, infatti ho sempre...
Veramente? Vuoi ripetere? Perché non ho capito bene.
Lei dà ai suoi quadri dei titoli ben precisi, Scuola d'Atene, Ratto delle Sabine, Amore e Psiche, che ricordano molto i soggetti cari agli autori del Rinascimento. D'altra parte, il mondo dell'antichità con i suoi miti ha acquistato un interesse nuovo dopo la psicanalisi. Lei ha presente questa connessione?
Sono tutta così istintiva per ora che se un momento perdo l'interesse il pensiero se ne va.
Quello te lo dico dopo, perché arriva dopo.
Ah, quello dopo. Allora dimmi in ordine di tempo.
In ordine di tempo?
In ordine di stimolo.
È meglio cominciare dalle cose più recenti, no? E dopo magari si va anche un po' indietro, ma non so, andando indietro, parlando così, in questo senso non significa niente, perché non c'è un processo formale. Cioè dici, dopo il paesaggio di Cézanne vengono i cubisti, dopo i cubisti viene Mondrian, eccetera.
Sorry, I just blocked
È lì
it.
che si basa la critica, appunto. Un processo del genere mette il quadro in una condizione estremamente...
Yes, so that was the reading. Sorry, I have to go back to the presentation. Which one?
It should go back to the same slide.
This one?
No.
Can't see. Yeah, magic, PowerPoint. So the key characteristic of autoritratto is the inscription of voice into the text. And Lonzi described this passage, this process, as a passage from sound to punctuation to a script, finding a page with no page which is already written. So the use of the tape recorder was very instrumental to that. And she used this metaphor of the chemical process, the transformation from gas to liquid, a sound that condensate into sign, un suono che si condensa in segno. And this mode of writing includes ams and ahs, laughter, exclamation, repetition, ellipsis, pauses, and it's the result very much of a very precise transcription, which was obviously possible by playing back the tape and listening to it. And here is a reel-to-reel tape, so one of early machine for that purposes. So it is through this impure writing generated through the use of the recorder that Lonzi withdraw her eloquent voice as an art critique, but also disown the artists of their mythical aura. Through the interview montage and the construction of a polyvocal text, Lonzi is giving voice to the artist, yet she exposed the singularity of each voice by paying attention to the rhythm and the grain of each utterance. Lonzi has been obsessed with the issue authenticity and of being authentic. But here, Lonzi, the art critic, recognized the authenticity of the artists not by valuing the originality of their works, but in creating a space for them to speak to one another frankly and directly in their voices. Although this collective space is a fiction, because autoritratto is a literary work, Lonzi employs these frameworks to reveal the ability of the artist of being a critical subject. And in the introduction of autoritratto, Lonzi wrote, "The truly critical act is the one which is part of the artistic creation. The artist is naturally critical, implicitly critical for her own critical structure." So, but what's happened when the art critique resigned from her own role? And what's happened if I'm no longer a critique? Lonzi asked to herself. I'm becoming an artist? And she replies, I'm not longer a stranger. But what follow after autoritratto is its involvement with Revolta Femminile. And Revolta Femminile, it was also a publishing house. It is one of the first alternative publishing initiative, publishing the manifesto of women in the time. And Lonzi was really the center of it, although many texts, many manifestos were actually co-written with the comrades of the collective. So, rereading Carla Lonzi in 2013, because obviously this book at the time was not really accepted in the 1960s, so it was not republished since 2010. So I discovered this book in 2010 because it was just republished. So the idea for me to go back to that text is it was not an opportunity to create an audiobook, but as I said before, to create a collective space, a convivial space, which was not subsumed by any institutional pressure And if the reading aloud have implied the difficulty of reperforming the mouth and the breath of other artists, other mouths, lending our lips, throat, tongue, turned to be a very, very funny exercise. So we have a lot of fun in doing this during these readings. And the pleasurable moment of encounter and discussion resulted very much an effective and social and cultural device through which a temporary community of reader was established. And I just define these voices of the present to rediscover the past and to reimagine the future. And that was Audrey Tautou. So I will now talk about the second project, which is the AudioArts magazine. Obviously, the diffusion of the tape recording in the late 60s and early 70s allowed various experiments in the field of visual arts, performance and experimental music, but also in terms of new form of publication. And if we think about the incredible variety of artist magazine, which included, beside printing matter, also cassette tapes and records, and there's a huge history out there to be discovered. AudioArts was one of those initiatives in the 70s, and it was completely dedicated to voice and sound. And here is a poster I designed of the whole issue from 1973 to 2007. So it started obviously as a tape magazine, and then in the 90s it was on CDs. Furlong and Barry Barker, Furlong most of all because he was the main editor since the inception of the magazine till the end. This idea of exploring the audio space as an alternative space, and Furlong defined it as a recorded space for contemporary art. So it works very much as an artisan space, parallel to the physical gallery, and it was the first magazine dedicated to contemporary art in a sound format. So it was thought as a kind of curatorial project as well. So artists were invited to do pieces for tape and think about the audio space as a kind of exhibition space. And it's important to say that these recordings, they were not made as documentation. There's a lot of recordings about talks and symposium and in the art at that time, so it's just a small percentage of the magazine. But the idea was not to do audio documentation, but the idea of retaining conversation and acoustic event in different formats and modes of speaking. And the AudioArts archive was purchased by Tate in 2004, and Tate has all the material related to the publication of the magazine, including unedited original interviews and a master copy of the tape and published cassette. And since 2013, Tate digitized all the issues that were published. So I welcome you to really visit this platform, because it's an incredible source of material. And so it's just simply at the Tate AudioArts. And here I just try to do a diagram and trying to map out different type of recordings, because AudioArts is mainly known as a magazine of artist interview, but in reality, the variety of recordings is quite extraordinary. So beside the interview made at the art fair or Venice Biennale, which Furlong called audio reportage, we have soundworks, sound by artists, like Dieter Roth contribute to it, Brooks McLean, and we have issue dedicated to experimental improvised music, and live performances recorded and edited back in the studio and produced for tape, poetry reading, and also very, very small percentage is archive recording. So all the recordings were made and produced by AudioArts, and that is a very, very important part of it. So quite an extraordinary variety of sound recording. But AudioArts in 1983, at that point, William Furlong was working with Michael Archer, art critic Michael Archer. They were very much a duo in the particular period, the 80s. They were invited to show at the sculptural show at the Hayward Gallery, and that probably was one of the first invitations to sound in a contest of to sound artists in a contest of an exhibition. And Furlong and Archer came up with the idea of doing a flexi disc for that catalog, which is quite fragile object, and they were all recording related to objects and spaces as a very basic concept of sculpture. And so that is when AudioArts started to expand its practice from the magazine also to thinking about the double relationship between the audio space and the exhibition space. And this is probably one of the early exhibition done in that way. So Live to Hair, which collects artist soundworks, and here we have musicians, but also visual artists, performer artists contribute to the tape. They are arranged in different themes, and the show was thought both as a sound tape cassette, but also as a kind of listening space in the gallery. And this is a picture of Tate, 1981, where there was a setup of all the recordings, and people could listen to it. So it was quite, at that time, it was not, it was quite new things to have sound in the gallery and listen to it. So since 1998, Furlong started to revisit the recordings of AudioArts in a series of sound installation. It's important to say that William Furlong is an artist, so the project always been considered part of his artistic practice and not, a curatorial endeavor. Although there is a strong crossover with that, so the first piece where he started thinking about how to revisit those recordings is called a conversation piece, and it's a collage of 4 voices: John Cage, Joseph Beuys, Marcel Duchamp, and Andy Warhol. And they are, at the exception of Marcel Duchamp, they're all recording made and produced by AudioArts. And I will play at a extract from it. So now I do that again. Sorry. Sorry, it's me. My fault.
The difference between
sorry, I start again.
What I was doing primarily was ignoring the difference between noises and musical tones and trying to make a larger group which could be called sounds, and that would include both of those.
Since I was not interested to stay with the idea of visual arts, I was interested to point at the necessity to determine the idea of art towards all possible senses existing in human beings, and even to develop new senses. If they are not there now, they will appear in the future.
Is it too loud?
Can, but as I don't attach any value, I mean commercial value or even artistic value to it.
If people are training and are really interested in art, they could develop even more senses.
That is the very difficult point, because art first has to be defined. All right. Can we try to define art? We have tried. Everybody has tried. And every century there's a new definition of art.
Those responding would be invisible.
Meaning that there's no essential, and one essential that is good for all centuries.
I would rather be baffled than to be clear, than to know what's going on.
So if we accept the idea of trying not to define art, which is a very legitimate conception, then the ready-made comes in as a sort of irony.
There's an instrument that is mysterious in the same way.
Because it says, here it is, a thing that I call art. I didn't even make it myself. As we know, art, etymologically speaking, means to make, hand make.
It gives you illusions about space.
And there, instead of making it, I take it ready-made.
If I know what's going on, I no longer have to go on.
So it was a form of denying the possibility of defining art. And because you don't define electricity, you just see the results of electricity, but you don't define it.
No, I just do whatever I do, just to get by.
Well, one could have those ideas, but what I was doing primarily was ignoring the difference between noises and musical tones.
That is the very difficult point.
And trying to make a larger group, which could be called sounds.
Art first has to be defined.
And that would include both of those.
No, I don't.
Just as the word humanity includes the rich and the poor.
All right.
So this is now related to the senses of touching, surely also to seeds. This remains. I'm not against vision, surely.
So my notion of sounds is all of them, not just noises and not just musical tones, but all of them.
As a sort of irony.
We often say, after hearing a group of sounds, we say the name of the composer, like Beethoven. I would rather remember the sounds.
I didn't feel that was necessary.
This stems from a Buddhist idea that all beings, whether sentient like human beings or non-sentient like sounds or stones, all beings are the Buddha.
Then only I felt people could get information from a wider understanding of art.
As we know, art, etymologically speaking, means to make.
Sometimes people get the idea or get the experience, and it changes their way of living.
Yes.
And every person, as an individual, is able to create his own culture completely. That is especially interesting to make clear on a person like Marcel Duchamp, who tried to destroy the whole kind of tradition.
Yes.
And was hinting towards common worker with his pissoir piece, because he said this is an artwork only in showing it in a special other context. But he missed the point completely to say and to find out the logics in saying, if this is a work of art which is not done for me, which is done from...
Okay, I think I ended here. Sorry, I wanted to fade out, but I don't know how to do it. So you have an idea of how the conversation develop. It's 15 minutes piece, so I just thought that to just play 5 minutes to give you a point. No, it's edited, yes. Basically, is a montage. Oops, so no. Okay. Yes, there's a striking parallel between Audrey Tautou and this piece. So they're both montage. And I think the montage is allowed precise because of the technology, the tape recorder. So taking different voices and putting them together. In the case of Lonzi is the text. In the case of Furlong is the audio montage. So Furlong called it this process a constructed conversation, because the conversation doesn't happen in a real space. Audrey Tautou is not a real gathering, it's a fiction. But the material, the source of the material are real sources, so they are the real voice of the artist. And then there is a lot of room there to play and to make works that addresses different issues. Obviously, for Lonzi, it was a way to deconstruct the power of the art critique, to present herself to the artist in a different view. And for Furlong, because it comes from sound, it was always connected to his sound practice of collaging and collage and cut and paste, and there's a lot of crossover with that technique. So the difference is also that for Furlong, if for Lonzi the idea was to inscribe the voice into the text, in Furlong this idea is to bring the voices back to the space, to the exhibition space. So, and here is important because all the interview that Furlong did for AudioArts are recordings on site. They are not BBC interview, they are not polished and post-produced interview. They are interview made in the studio of the artist or at the exhibition. So, and they include a lot of environmental sound. Above all, the recordings they did at the Venice Biennale. You have the footstep going to Giardini. You hear all the sound of the birds, and so they are quite site-specific recordings, really. But it's interesting how Furlong used those archival recordings. It mapped them back into the space through this installation, and very, 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 very minimal installation. So they are kind of orchestrated through the sound system, but of course, Furlong and Lonzi didn't know each other. They come from completely different cultural contexts, and it will be wrong to kind of locate them in the same context. But I think here is the use of the tape recorder and the sound that really inform those different practices, which it was interesting for me to look at. So one artist that Furlong interviewed several times is Joseph Beuys, that we just heard in the other recording, and in particular, he interviewed him in different, in the occasion of different exhibition in London, but also he recorded Beuys when he showed when he was part of this show at the IC8, and Furlong, Beuys, all he wanted for that exhibition was a blackboard. He said, "My interest in the exhibition is in my permanent presence. No special space is needed, just 4 blackboards, some red and white chalk, and a wooden chest. When I have to be absent, the blackboard would stand for my presence." And that is really the beginning of the artist going in the gallery and using the gallery as a kind of space for dialogue and speaking. So what Beuys was doing with that blackboard was speaking to people and making notes and then leaving the blackboard there and coming back. And this particular exhibition, Beuys took for over 3 days. So, and Furlong was there recording every single minute of it. And it's quite an extraordinary recording. And I'm going to play a fragment of it. Da, da, da. I need to turn the volume up.
have to be done.
Sorry, I have to go back.
Yes. Now we have to speak once more about the new necessity that the things have to be done. Then we see that the government cannot make these things and cannot give out this knowledge, and the specialists in faculties too are not able to do it. Then we must find people, must really collect people who are who have already a bit of this ability, and people who are interested to reach abilities. This must be the first step. And we have to care that we find as soon as possible a quantity as possible of people who are propagating this idea, to informating about this new way to go, about the necessity to go this way, because there is no other way to go. The established systems in the world are well known. There are only two in the principle: the Western private capitalistic system and the Eastern communistic system with the Politburo, in the principle one political party dictatorship. Both sides are special owners of means of production. Here in the West, the private owners of the means of production. There's the other private owner, the Politburo, as a private owner. In the principle, that's the same thing. The same thing. There's a special difference that in the Eastern countries, where the lack is that there is not individual freedom. And with the difference in the Western private countries, there's not enough possibility for brotherhood in economics. Because here is still existing a rest of freedom. Yes, for instance, I can speak about a revolutionary model now. I could not do it in Russia. Here I can do it. But because why I can do it is not a result of the politicians, it is a result from tradition. It stems from the bourgeois revolution, the French Revolution, with her ideals, freedom, equality, brotherhood.
This is an edited transcript.
Sorry. Up. So there was a very short extra from from boys talking at the ICA to different people, and Tate has the whole recording, so there are just interaction with different visitors asking questions to him. Let's see if it works now. So yeah, you can listen to 30 minutes of this recording online on the Tate website. So as part of my PhD, I explore the archive of recordings, and I particularly use this recording as one of the case studies, and so I organized a series of workshops around it, which I titled them "From Transcription to Transduction," and I will explain in a minute what I mean by that. And so I invited participant to transcribe the text of the boys, the recording, to make a text, and then think in different modes of transcription. And this idea of the transduction came about very much from the book Jonathan Stern, Audible Past. Obviously, the transducer are very important in sound reproduction technology. It's those elements that are allowed to turn sound into something else, and that something else into sound. And probably you know better than me these things, because I'm not a sound person. But the whole things, it's resonate to me, because I find out that the early way to produce interviews for BBC, it was made in this way. The interview was recorded, then transcribed. From the transcription was made a script, and then the script was reread aloud and recorded back. So this idea that we have these natural voices on BBC is totally, it's totally constructed voice, and that was their early days. So this idea of turning sound to the sound is, I find a very fascinating metaphor for actually looking at the history of the artist interview and how it's been produced and published and transmitted to us today. So this idea of the authentic voice of the artist can be questioned, because the mode of writing that comes from the artist interview can be also very much post-produced. So now I'm gonna play one of the recording I done during the workshop. And I ask, in this case, to pay attention to the intonation of the voice. So it was not important to transcribe every single word, but pay attention to the intonation, transcribe it, and then reperform it. And that is the result. And that was done just in a workshop. It was not done for any production. It's just simply an exercise.
New necessity that the things have to be done, and we see that the government cannot make these things and cannot give out this knowledge, and that the specialists in faculties too are not able to do this. We must find people, collect people who are interested a bit these problems, abilities. This must be the first step. We have to care that we find as possible quantity of people who are propagating this idea, this new way of informating about the new ways to do these things. The established systems in the world are well known. There are only two principal ones: the Western private capitalistic system and the Eastern communistic system, with a Politburo, with the principle of a one political party dictatorship. Both sides are the special owners of the means of production. Here in the West, there are the private owners of the means of production. There are the Politburo, or the private owners. As a private owner is in principle the same thing, with a special difference that in the Eastern countries, where there's a lack, there is not the individual freedom. There is special difference in the Western private countries, is that there is not enough possibility for brotherhood in economics, because still exists a rest of freedom. But why I could do it, I can speak here, I can speak about a revolutionary moral now. But I could not do it in Russia. In Russia. Here I can do it. But because why I can do it is that it's not as a result of politicians, it is a result of tradition. It stems from the bourgeois revolution, the French Revolution, with these ideas of freedom, equality, and brotherhood.
So, and that was the exercise. It's quite extraordinary that we done on the spot. There was no any, there's not any post-production in this. It just purely as it is. And it resulted a very powerful tool to think about how to transcribe and how to perform, and how much material you can generate with that simple device. So, okay. I want to introduce now a little digression, a theoretical one. Don't be afraid. But this book, I want to talk about just very briefly about Adriana Cavarero book, Towards a Philosophy of Vocal Expression, for more than one voice. And it's a very influential book for me. Adriana Cavarero is an Italian philosopher that I interviewed a few years ago. it's a very important reference in my work, both as a curator and researcher. And Caballero, in her book, she argued that voice is always relational. Voice, she said, is sound, not speech, but speech constitutes its essential destination. And precisely because speech is sonorous, to speak to one another is to communicate oneself to others in the plurality of voices. According to her, it is a prejudice to think that outside speech, the voice is nothing, an insignificant leftovers. Caballero focused her study on vocal expression, or what she called vocality, as the main point of investigation. And vocal expression for her is the communication of communication, because what does communicate is embodied in uniqueness and expressed through the voice. And her project looks very much about the devaluation of the vocalic part of logos in Western metaphysics, and she looked at the power of the semantic over the vocal and how this goes hand in hand with the devaluation of the female subjectivity. So the notorious dichotomy of the symbolic patriarchal order, where according to which man is conceived as mind and the power to think, and woman is relegated to body. She can sing, but she cannot speak eloquently. So, and she does a lot of all the chapters are constructed around examples from the myth, from the myth of Echo to the writing of 6 U's, and so she used a lot of references to different women work, which is an extraordinary book. And in polemic with Derrida, because there is always this reference to Derrida and presence of voice, above all in certain books that write about sound and sound art. And I like the position of Caballero, because she said that we don't have voice to listen. In polemic with Derrida, she said, we don't have voice to listen to ourselves speaking to ourselves, generating monologues. We have to communicate with others through dialogue. And she said, and I quote, the thesis that the ear is there, at Derrida put it, to hear oneself speak is curiously narcissistic and metaphysically suspect. So I think it's quite interesting that this chapter on Derrida, if you are a Derridian person, probably it's a quite a different take, and I recommend it to read it. So the work of Adriana Caballero was very important in this moment, as I said, where there was a lot of anxiety around work, repositioning myself as a curator, and 2011, obviously Occupy in London was a big moment for me, at least, and also other. But in that moment, I wrote an article for an Italian magazine, and I used Caballero and to kind of describe these different modes of speaking. And here you have that, the little group that use those protocol, jazz hands and all of that kind of protocol for listening and speaking, which has actually a long history. So it was very interesting to observe that. And so when Brandon Labelle, in editor of Aram Bodies, invited me to write a proposal for their new series, Doormats, which is not sound, but actually about the debate, contemporary debate, what's happening now, I had discussed this idea of reflecting about listening in that political context, and that was the beginning of the book, which I decided to co-write with Claudia Firth, writer and an activist. So we were both occupied doing different workshops with the Precarious Workers Brigade around precarity and working condition. So the book started really from practice and from observing the situation. And and it's not at all an academic book. It wanted really to reflect on these direct experiences, but we also use theory. I interviewed Cavarero, Nicole, so to think about the practice, but also how this practice can be supported by theory. And so at that time also I realized there was a huge gap in the literature, because since 2000 we know there is a lot of books on sound, and probably you read them all. I don't. But there's very, very little still on listening in political theory. And one of the books is from Susan Bickford, 1995. Now there is quite a lot of happening in terms of analyzing, investigating what politics of listening are and what they do. So, but at that time there was a kind of gap, and I really wanted to move away from the idea of the sound as an object, but also move away from the idea of listening as an aesthetic practice. Not because I'm against about the listening as an aesthetic practice, but because I wanted to explore different way of thinking about listening. And the dialogic practices for me was that point. And of course the project that I also curated or produced were in line with that idea. So the book is written in dialogic form. And this idea of writing dialogic form comes from Audrey Tautou. So Lonzi for me was a kind of inspiration to think about how to write a book which in a way embodied the voices. And here is, again, a constructed conversation. The people on the page they never met. And we interviewed them individually. And so the interview were done with the member of Ultra Red, the Precarious Workers Brigade, the artists Irene Anastas and René Gabri. But also we interviewed two women that took place, they were part of different feminist conscience raising group in the 70s, because we realized that there is a legacy of feminists very important in dialogic practices, in political dialogic practices, and somehow the book tried really to address that gap as well in literature, to look at feminist literature which talk about voice and listening from a different perspective. So we arranged those conversations in different chapters according to different themes that come through the conversation. And so we cover different topics, issue of voice, collectivity, what does it mean to do this practice within institutional framework, ethical listening, and so the book, as I said at the beginning, maybe is explore the intersection between art and activism, and here the idea is to look at listening as a practice, what listening does and how it's organized, and in a way is different from the pure perception of hearing. So, and Paulina Riveros probably, we use Paulina Riveros as in the book as an example of a practitioner that differentiates this idea of hearing as a involuntary perception, and listening as an activity that can be cultivated and practiced. So we dedicated one chapter about consciousness raising, and Adriana Cavarero, obviously, politics of voice was very important to understand the importance of the embodied voice, but also Cavarero notion of embodied voice and was also very important to speak about practices of direct speech and direct democracy. So this idea of talking to each other, and I would like maybe to go back a bit. There's many things in the book that I can explore, but I think we are coming to the end of my time, and I just want to flag up two things. Carla Lonzin, after the Audrey Tautou, she wrote a diary, and it was her reflection as a feminist in '78, and then she described consciousness raising as in terms of resonance, and here resonance is a metaphor for recognition. The recognition which gives birth to the subject while expressing another subject, which can subsequently be recognized in the operation that brought my process to the goal of autocoscienza. Autocoscienza is the name for conscious raising. So this idea of reciprocal reciprocity of speaking and listening and consciousness raising, as I don't know if you are familiar with the technique they were used, or the way that these groups were meeting, where they were all women-only group. They were sitting in a room, going around the group, make sure that everybody was speaking and listening. And so it was also the first moment where the women recognized their own issue, and that their own issue was not individual issue, they were social issues. So it was a moment, consciousness raising was really important tool to lead, to build up the women movement. So, and in every corner of the, of different city, there was many conscience raising group in the 70s. So, and here is just to point maybe two examples. In 2011, the Precarious Workers Brigade organized this people tribunal, which is an interesting format where people give different testimony. And in this case, we collected testimonies about exploitation in the art world and cultural sector, so it was quite painful for many people there. But the testimonies were read out by different members of the Precarious Workers Brigade. So this idea of giving a testimony, not attached to the proper name, was very important to create a safe space for the people in the room, not make them feel too exposed. And that idea of retaining the singularity of the voice, but actually voice this through the collective, it was an incredible, powerful tool that create a lot of solidarity between people. And from then, Precarious Workers Brigade really start making different action and get organized. Ultra Red, obviously, you're probably familiar. I think Ultra Red gave a workshop here recently at LCC, so probably you are familiar with them. They define themselves sound activists, and their methodology is called militant sound investigation. The collective was established in 1994 from AIDS activists originally, and then it expanded to artists and researchers and organizers. And their protocol of listening come very much from popular education, consciousness raising, radical pedagogy. And here the listening is really much a tool for political organizing. It's not for making artwork in the gallery. It's actually to get a group of people to get organized and to try to change the condition in which they are. The other people that we interview is Arina Anastas and Regina Gabri, two artists. They not define themselves as activists, but their approach is very bordering activism, is getting very close to activist mode of working. They organized this project during Documenta 13 called And Then. This is just a very nice caption they use for their project. And they use a space in Documenta 100 where for 101 days they organize discussion, cooking together, and film screening. So it was really much a space to think what commoning might be. So and how to inhabit an institutional framework, how to push the boundary of the institution and create that kind of social space. And of course, there is a lot of discussion what this kind of operation or practice they do in relation to the public sphere and what is outside the art context. Yes, I think I will just draw few points for the conclusion of my talk, very, very quickly. So in the 70s, dialogic practices have been very instrumental tools for political dissent, but also for a new art form. And this was the colloquium done for the show at the ICA. So it was done very democratically. And the legacy of feminist political practice had been key in dialogue and relational process. This is a picture of one of them. So while as an art historian, I think it's important to historically contextualize works that are still on the margin, and this is my role as a researcher now. I'm going to the archive and pull out material and say, hey, here it is, the project that was done in 1973. So the way that I want to reread the past in the case of Lonzi, Audrey Tautou, but also in relation to AudioArts, is to activate these works as potential topic for the present. So the work of Lonzi resonate within me and prompt me to follow a path rather than another. It's a kind of here and now in the present moment. And in a period where any art form, any art conversation, any performance is kind of co-opted into this logic of profit, success, competition. I think to create this moment of micropolitics are very, very vital. And so I think the difficulty is how to maintain this space, And this is a picture of me at Tune City, where I was asked to chair a panel on listening politics. And provocatively, I asked to the audience and to myself, are we here performing politics or trying to refigure out that public sphere in terms of Hannah Arendt, in terms of Cavarero, in terms of all this notion of public space related to speech and space. And obviously this is a theater, and this is the Agora, which is quite symbolic space. But I still think that conviviality is a very important, and I still think the art has a great power in creating those islands and cultivate joy, the joy of making things together. So in one hand, for me, it's very important this intersectional art activism and how you can move from one side to another, but continue to make work and be creative. So I end my talk here, and so you can, if you're interested, there's Sound Threshold website. Disaster is not updated, but you can find all the projects that I presented this morning, the day before. And the book is a free download now, so I'm very happy. So you can go, and if you want to know more about my academic research, that is the link. So yes, thank you for listening 1 hour and a half for my talk. Any questions?
Thank you, Lucia. Okay, questions, comments?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for that. It was very interesting. I actually want to divert the conversation to something that you mentioned at the beginning, which was the work that you've done at the Freud Museum.
Yes.
I'm really interested in the links between sound and psychoanalysis, or maybe, I guess, maybe the associations with sound to kind of a primal being, or when, you know, in our mother's womb, or when we were just babies, or the whole development of the psyche, of the self. Do you have anything?
Well, well, there's a lot of things there. Psychoanalysis is again another listening-based practice. It's a speech therapy. Okay, so and that and then there is kind of interesting point of what is the difference between musical listening and psychoanalytic listening. There is a lot written about it. I'm not an expert in psychoanalysis, but Roland Barthes, in his book *The Grain of the Voice*, I think he talks about the grain of the voice, the listening. So the connection is with the acousmatic listening, because what a psychoanalyst listens is not what you said, is what you don't say. And as for me, it's a very interesting connection between the disembodied voice of recorded sound. So this is quite interesting way to go. Funnily enough, Freud was totally unmusical. He couldn't really, you know, he likes Mozart, and but he was totally unmusical. And he was suffering also of hearing voices. So his interpretation of Jean-Paul Sartre is very much about himself as well. So there is a lot of construction there as well. So, and I've been in psychoanalysis for a while, and it was a very interesting part of my investigation, personal investigation. At the same time, I think it's a tool as art. So, you know, I see in that way. But yeah.
I was looking more on the personal sound that each of us have, like the portrait of the sound, like the portrayal of the sound, like something that is, you know, very unique, something that refers to some real, you know, like maybe not from Freud, maybe from Lacan, you know, the Lacanian real, the one that it's not accessible, but there's something about the voice, our voices, that, you know, gives some sort of access. I feel like I'm at the beginning of kind of this research for me.
Well, the psychoanalysts listen to the slippages and listen to the intonation, listen to how you speak. So the vocality, what Cavallero talk about it, is very important. But in relation to Cavallero, she doesn't look at psychoanalysis at all. A lot of psychoanalysts like her work, but she doesn't engage with that at all. So it's interesting how there's a crossover there. So this attention to the materiality of voice, where in psychoanalysis is more about your emotion, the things that cannot be said, the things you are not able to say, to address, to articulate.
Thank you. Any others? One thing I was wondering about, I noticed that the AudioArts flexi disc that you showed had HM Prison Brixton on it. Do you know what that was about?
Oh yeah. Side one of Objects and Spaces are interviews prisoner. So Furlong went to the prison and asked each a different prisoner, what are objects in the spaces, and they describe what they have in their space. So it's quite interesting. Yeah. Yeah, they describe the cell, there's a table, there's this and that, so they're describing objects in spaces. But it's obviously the interest of Furlong to use that idea also of interaction with people that are not completely related to the art context. So, and there has always been this interest in Furlong because his work is not just based on artist interview. He did a lot of conversation in the street, a lot of sound work that is not at Tate. Still in his personal archive are actually fragment, vox pop gathered in the street. What do you think about this? What is this? So there is this kind of approach which is of voice, which is not like just the artist's voice. His voice is the act of communication.
I wonder if, I don't know how many people here know anything about the Precarious Workers Brigade, so maybe you could give a sort of overview of what that, where that came from and what it is.
Well, it was originated from 3 different moments. It was first of all a group of research and artists and that start talking about micropolitics, and then the group, one working group wanted to focus very much on the working condition, and it was called Precarious Workers, and a lot of us experience issue of self-exploitation, exploitation in the work, in the cultural work. So we look specifically at the issue of internship, because at that point in 2010 is when a lot of institutions start using students or people doing internship, but actually covering position of unpaid work. So we did a lot of campaigning about that. So we wrote letter to different institutions to say, hey, this is not, because an internship normally is supposed to be a training experience. So you go there to learn something. But in many cases, we realized it was not that. It was just simply unpaid labor. So we work a lot on that. We send letter out and try to raise awareness about that. And then the last things we did is a book, which, it's like a toolbox with different way on which you can address those issues and not be isolated, and trying to form, solidarity with other people. So at the moment, the collective is a bit in crisis because we are having so many other things. There are babies, there are PhD, there are so many things. So we don't have time, we don't have capacity. But so and suddenly the precarity is not just about working conditions; it's housing. Now Brexit, there's so many issues to address all the time. Then you feel like the priority is not just talking about internship right now. Yeah.
You mentioned aesthetic theory very briefly.
Sorry?
You mentioned aesthetic theory very briefly, and I was just wondering if you feel that your work, the work that you create, is sort of representative of a new musicology.
Oh wow, that's a difficult question. Which work are you referring to in terms of musicology?
Adorno.
Oh, okay. All right, that's a difficult one. Well, it's always difficult, that bordering between aesthetics and politics, and we had a very hard time to discuss this in the book. Above all, trying to deconstruct the position on Rancière, and it depends very much on your definition of aesthetics and what become, because I think there is a kind of misunderstanding above all in an English-speaking context the aesthetics about beauty, or and aesthetics. Obviously, the etymology comes from perceptions of the senses, and that is the first act in which we relate with the world. So perception is important, affect is important. There's a huge literature now on affect. So on that perspective, yes, I'm interested in the aesthetics and what that perception does, the impact of it, okay, as a human being. The problem I have is when aesthetics is kind of framed within institutional context. So when suddenly to do an artwork and to speak about politics in a gallery becomes simply, for me, it's not politics, speaking about politics. Politics for me is about change, trying to change things. And I think the issue at stake here between art and activism is the issue of accountability. You think you do your work as an artist, and that is that. The responsibility is just to deliver the work. But when you work with people, when you do a community project, or you involve other people, there is always an issue of ethics. And that, for me, is where it's becoming difficult. And I don't say, so I'm this or that. I like the slippery terrain of the intersection, because I think when you're trying to define things, oh, this is aesthetic, oh, this is art, this is activism, then you lose out, because somebody capitalized on that definition somehow. Instead, if you don't define what you do, there's much more space for action, both creatively and politically. So from an art historian point of view, in the book, I don't define if ultra-red, they are some activists, or I don't care if they're called activists, the artists, they're creative people, they are cultural works. It's not about that, it's what their work do. And in terms of organizing people, they do a lot. So as much as probably I read on Stas and René Gambri in terms of creative practice, they have a certain impact. So it comes down to context, really, and more than the theory for me. Did I explain enough?
Any other questions? I just wondered, since I don't see any hands up, I'll keep asking questions. How you feel about I suppose the potential conflict in a way between a piece of writing like The Force of Listening and the kind of activism you just spoke about, the kind of publication you said came out of the Precarious Workers Brigade that was designed to help people, and the very public political protest of the Occupy movement and things, and then kind of distilling that in a way into a piece of writing that's arguably preaching to the converted, in a sense, that on a small group of people who probably already agree with you politically will read. I just wonder about that tension. And
yes, so in the book, actually, so I said this here, the book's not on Precarious Worker Brigade, so maybe when I said the book before by the Precarious Workers Brigade is another book. It's called about employability. These books, okay. But the idea for me was to reflect on different modality, and yes, if you like, it is a product, isn't it? It's out there, but the way we we've been using the book after the publishing is very much for workshops. So Claudia today is doing a workshop. And the dialogic form was instrumental, not to say this is what needs to be done, is to keep the conversation open and trying to think how other conversation can happen. So it's more designed as a tool rather than a book that goes in your CV or goes in the academia. In fact, it doesn't have a distribution, academic distribution, and I decided that it's very important to have a free download for that reason. It doesn't give me.
I didn't mean it as a criticism. In a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have contradictions in our work.
No. I mean,
quite interested in how you resolve that.
The problem is with Precarious Workers Brigade is that anonymity is very important. So normally we never introduce ourselves as our name. When Precarious Workers Brigade does the action, we are there as people, as Precarious Workers Brigade. So just to avoid a kind of conflictual position of and also for safety reasons. So when I went to the Tate and I have to do a speak and criticize what they were doing, I didn't use my proper name. The action they always done collectively. So, and there is obviously a split. In my case, there's a kind of split between the two practice, because I have to go back to Tate and then do the work 2 years later. So. And I think for me it's more inhabiting different identity and playing with that and say, okay, I use the cap of the curator now because I want to get there. I want to use the cap of the activist because that is important, and I do this collectively. And I use the cap of the writer when I want. So I think that is a possibility for me of inhabiting different identity to be slippery in order to what I want to do and to want to achieve. So, and sometimes there is contradiction. You say, okay, I do the book, but it was important to do the book because that gives you an idea of what people think behind the practice, how this practice come about, and it's not an academic book saying, that theory or that theory, and But in the book, my voice as a PWB is not in my name. So we kept that kind of conversation, the double voices, they are there, the voices are there, but the way, so we're trying to kind of reflect on that.
Any other questions? I'm going to continue to ask questions.
There is some sound as well if you want to listen to anything.
Does anyone want to have any requests?
You want to listen to the couch, under the couch? Yeah, let's play some Leif Elgren, some noise.
We've got another 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I think 2 minutes is good of Leif Elgren now. No, you're a noise person, this is why you love it. Oops. So as my analyst used to say, time is over. Thank you.